My son sat across from me at dinner, smiled, and asked about my will. I smiled back. What he didn't know, I already knew everything. 6 months earlier, my husband Daniel died and left behind something worth millions. Within weeks, the son who hadn't called me in 3 years suddenly couldn't stop calling. He asked about my trusts, my accounts, who would step in if something happened to me. Every question wrapped in concern, every word rehearsed. I kept telling myself he was grieving. I kept telling myself he was just worried about his mother. I was wrong. The morning I found out what he had actually been doing behind my back, I sat in my kitchen, stared at 40 years of memories on these walls, and made one decision. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. First, I was going to let him think it was working. This is the story of what happened next, and I promise you, the ending will change how you see the people closest to you. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 68 years old. My husband Daniel and I built Brooks Cold Chain Logistics from nothing. One aging truck, one rented storage unit outside Nashville, and two people who refused to quit no matter how hard things got. By the time I agreed to sell, the company operated across multiple states and employed hundreds of people. It was never just a business. It was 40 years of our lives poured into something real. Daniel passed away 14 months before the sale closed. I made the decision to sell alone, and I carried that weight alone, too. Only a handful of people knew about the pending deal: my attorney, my financial team, and my son, Ethan. For 3 years before that, Ethan and I had barely spoken. Not a fight, not a dramatic falling out, just distance. The kind that grows slowly between people until one day you realize you haven't had a real conversation in months. I told myself it was grief. His grief. My grief. Two people who didn't know how to be around each other after losing the man who held them together. Then the week the sale was announced, almost overnight, everything changed. Ethan started calling every few days. He asked how I was eating, whether I needed help around the house, whether the loneliness was getting to me. He sent flowers on a Tuesday for no reason. He mentioned visiting for the holidays. For the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back. I held on to that. But after the fourth or fifth call, something started bothering me, a pattern I couldn't explain away. No matter where the conversation started, whether memories, old family stories, it always drifted to the same place. Money, the sale, the future, who was managing my finances, whether I had updated my estate plan, whether I'd thought about simplifying things. I told myself he was just being responsible. I told myself any good son would ask these questions. I almost believed it. Then he invited me to dinner. Private room, just the two of us, his idea, his reservation, his choice of restaurant. And something I hadn't felt in years quietly showed up in my chest. Not warmth, worry. Most of us have had that feeling. Someone close starts acting differently, and something in your gut knows before your mind catches up. Has that ever happened to you? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story is pulling you in, hit like and follow so you're here when things start unraveling. The restaurant sat above the Cumberland River. The kind of place where every table feels private and every detail is designed to make you feel safe. Ethan was already waiting when I arrived. He stood up the moment he saw me, hugged me longer than usual, pulled out my chair before I could reach it. For the first 20 minutes, it felt like having my son back. We talked about Daniel. We laughed about an old camping trip where a raccoon destroyed half our food. I caught myself relaxing. I caught myself thinking maybe I had imagined all of it. Then the conversation shifted, slowly, carefully, the way a river bends. You don't notice until you're already somewhere different. He asked whether the sale was still on schedule, whether the money would transfer immediately or over time, how the trusts were structured, who else was involved in the process. Each question sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they told a completely different story. I watched his eyes. Every time the conversation moved away from finances, he looked distracted. Every time it returned, he came fully alive again. Then his phone buzzed. He turned it face down without looking at it. It buzzed again. The third time, he excused himself and stepped into the hallway. Through the glass partition, I could see him, not talking, arguing. When he came back, his smile was tighter than before, his answers shorter, his eyes somewhere else entirely. That's when my phone rang. My attorney. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. I stepped into the hallway and answered. He didn't waste time. "Eleanor, did you authorize anyone to request copies of your estate planning documents this week?" I stopped walking. "No? Why?" One short silence, then 7 words I will never forget. "Because someone tried to access them today." I stood completely still in that hallway. Through the glass, I could see Ethan at our table, calmly checking his phone, completely relaxed, completely unaware that everything had just changed. Every question he had asked over the past month came rushing back at once. Every careful word, every concerned smile, every conversation that somehow always found its way back to my money. I walked back to the table, sat down, smiled at my son, and said nothing. Because now I needed answers, not arguments. Answers. That moment when something someone says completely reframes everything you thought about them, it hits different. Has a single phone call or conversation ever changed the way you saw someone you trusted? Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't followed yet, do it now. What happens next is where this story gets truly dark. I didn't confront Ethan that night. After 40 years in business, I learned one thing that never failed me. Facts beat emotions every single time. So I called my attorney first thing the next morning. Then I called a forensic accountant who'd worked with our company through several major acquisitions. By that afternoon, both of them were digging. 3 days later, the first answers arrived, and they were worse than anything I had imagined. The request had been filed in Ethan's name, and whoever submitted it knew details that were not publicly available. Specific trust structures, internal file references, names connected to my private estate planning, information that could only come from someone who'd been studying my finances for a long time. Then the accountant called and asked me to sit down. Over 4 years, Ethan had buried himself inside a series of catastrophic business failures. A real estate partnership that collapsed, a private investment group that dissolved, high-risk projects that never returned a dollar. Debt rolled into more debt, personal guarantees hidden inside corporate agreements. The total number, when everything was added together, was staggering, enough to keep any person awake every night. Then, a former business partner of Ethan's asked to meet me privately. He slid a folder across the table. Lawsuits, creditor demands, settlement agreements, numbers far worse than anything the accountant had already found. Then he leaned forward and said something that made the room feel cold. About 6 months ago, Ethan became obsessed with one topic. I asked what topic. He said one word: inheritance. According to him, Ethan talked constantly about trusts, asset transfers, and estate timelines. Everyone assumed he was planning his own future. Eventually, they realized he was planning around mine. That night, my attorney called with one final discovery. Someone had been trying to access my estate documents. They had been researching what would happen to my finances if I became unable to manage them myself. Not after my death, while I was still alive. I sat in Daniel's old chair that night and looked at 40 years of photographs on the wall. The boy learning to ride a bicycle, the teenager standing beside his father on the first day of high school, the man who had just spent months quietly mapping every path to my money. The debts hadn't created the plan, they had only accelerated it. Everything had started long before the money ran out. If this story shook something in you, share it. Someone you know may be sitting in a situation exactly like this right now, and they don't even see it yet. One share could protect someone you love. And tell me honestly in the comments, do you think financial desperation reveals who a person truly is, or does it change them into someone they never were before? I want to know what you actually think. I called Ethan the next morning and asked him to come over. No warning, no anger in my voice, just a simple request. Come over. He agreed immediately. 2 hours later, he walked through my front door with the same confident smile I had seen at the restaurant. The smile disappeared the moment he saw me sitting at the dining room table with a folder in front of me. He looked at the folder, then at me. "Mom, what's going on?" For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I was remembering teaching him to ride a bicycle in the same driveway, sitting beside his hospital bed when he broke his arm at 11, watching Daniel hold him for the first time and promise he would always protect him. Those memories made what came next hurt in a way I cannot fully describe. I slid the documents across the table. I know about the estate requests. I know about the debt. I know about the lawsuits. And I know you have been asking questions about my trusts and assets for months. The color left his face completely. He didn't touch the papers, didn't deny recognizing them, didn't ask where they came from. He just stared. Then he covered his face with both hands, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked exhausted instead of confident. The truth came out slowly. The failed businesses were real. The debt was real. The pressure from creditors was real. He had convinced himself that once my company sold, everything would somehow work itself out. Then reality hit. None of that money was ever his. Not $1. Not one decision. "I panicked," he said. "I started looking for options." "Options," I repeated. "You mean my money." He couldn't look at me. The silence that felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Then I asked the question I had been afraid to ask for weeks. "Ethan, if nobody had caught those requests, how far were you prepared to go?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. And that silence told me more than any confession ever could. Before the final part, tell me honestly in the comments, if you were in my seat that day, could you have stayed calm, or would you have lost it completely? I genuinely want to know. 3 months after that confrontation, Ethan called and asked to meet one final time. Not to argue, not to explain, just to talk. We met at my attorney's office. When Ethan walked in and saw documents on the table, I could see exactly what he was thinking. He was still thinking about money. My attorney opened a folder and slid a single document toward him. "Your mother asked us to review the estate plan she created with her late husband." Ethan frowned. "I don't understand." I looked directly at him. "Your father and I made a decision decades ago. We agreed that no child, no relative, and no beneficiary would ever receive direct control of everything we built. The proceeds from this sale have been transferred into protected trusts, educational funds, charitable initiatives, and long-term legacy accounts." Ethan stared at me, then at the documents, then back at me. What are you saying? I am saying there was never a version of the story where you inherited control of this money. He shook his head slowly. That's impossible. My attorney slid another document across the table. The structure was established years before your father's death. I watched the realization move across my son's face like a slow wave. Every secret request, every rehearsed question, every carefully worded conversation over months, every lie, every manipulation, none of it would have changed a single dollar, not one signature, not one outcome. The thing he had risked our entire relationship for was something he could never have controlled in the first place. I stood up, picked up my purse, and said the last thing I ever wanted to have to teach my own son. Ethan, you spent months believing the greatest thing your father left behind was money. You were wrong. It was trust. And unlike money, once trust is gone, no amount of success, no amount of time, and no amount of apology can ever fully bring it back. Then I walked out. I never looked back. I visit Daniel's grave every few months. I told him everything: the betrayal, the investigation, the confrontation, the ending. And then I told him the one thing that mattered most. Everything we spent 40 years building together, it survived. Our legacy survived. And for the first time since that dinner above the river, I felt something I had almost forgotten: peace. If this story reached you, share it right now with someone who trusts too easily or loves too blindly. Some people need to hear this before they learn it the hard way. And leave me one final thought in the comments. Do you believe a person who betrays family for money can ever truly change? I read every word you write.